Hello and welcome. We are going to go over the metabolic map for our Essential Medical Bioscience or Biology Basics online course. So in the lecture you have learned that the primary fuel for our cells is usually glucose. And glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. And for the purposes of creating the metabolic map, we're going to represent it as a 6-carbon sequence like this. So this is the shortcut way of showing a glucose molecule. So this is our glucose molecule. This is what we start with. Okay. So the first step in breaking down glucose for energy would be to split it in half. That process is called glycolysis. And this process is completely reversible. So splitting glucose in half yields 2 units of 3 carbons each, like that. So what you've done is you just split the glucose in half. Each one of these are called pyruvate molecules. So these are pyruvate molecules. Okay. Now, the glycolysis itself, while you're splitting the glucose like that in half, it will yield 2 ATP molecules. And this process does not require oxygen at all. Okay. Now, if you want to keep going and get more ATPs out of these pyruvate molecules, you would have to put each pyruvate molecule through a special step. And this is, remember, this is a one-way step reaction that does require oxygen. This is where you actually take oxygen and cut off one of the carbons from the pyruvate, and you will end up with only 2 carbon units like that, and they are called acyl groups. Okay, the acyl groups usually get attached to a coenzyme A, and the complex of acyl attached to a coenzyme A is called acetyl-CoA. If you've taken biology courses before, that would sound more familiar to you, acetyl-CoA. But for the purposes of this class, and just to keep things super simple, we're just going to call them acyl groups. Okay. Now, once again, this step of turning pyruvate into the acyl group is a one-step process, one-way process. So this process is completely irreversible, and it requires oxygen. Okay, you cannot do this step without the oxygen. Okay, the remaining steps in using the glucose that turned into pyruvate, that turned into acyl groups, the remaining steps require oxygen. So from here on, you need oxygen. Need oxygen for all these steps. So from here, acyl groups will go through Krebs cycles. Okay, Krebs cycles, and each Krebs cycle yields 1 more ATP. And an ATP here. And that is followed by the electron transport chain. Electron transport chain that yields 17 more ATPs on each side. Okay, so 17 ATPs here and 17 ATPs here. So if you count all the ATPs you're going to get all together, that's 2 ATPs from glycolysis. That does not require oxygen. Then an ATP from each Krebs cycle, from each half of the glucose that was left over. And then 17 more from each side on the electron transport chain. That would put together 17 and 17, 34. 35, 36, 37, 38 ATPs altogether you can get by burning one glucose molecule, again, with oxygen. Okay, now if you don't have enough oxygen in your cells to burn the glucose with oxygen, you're going to burn it without oxygen. So that means that's not even burning, actually, because burning means making something react with oxygen. If you don't have enough oxygen, then this is as far as you can go. So this is how far you can go without oxygen. Okay, so you will stop at pyruvate. You cannot do the rest of these steps. And without oxygen, you're going to take these pyruvate molecules and turn them into lactic acid. Okay, lactic acid. So that's what you do without the oxygen. So at the moment, for example, if you're working out, right, you're running somewhere or you're climbing stairs and suddenly your muscles are not getting enough oxygen to burn glucose aerobically, your muscles will start using glucose anaerobically and will turn the glucose into lactic acid. Okay. The next day, the lactic acid is going to get removed from your tissues, from your muscles, and sent to the bloodstream. And then the lactic acid will get turned back into glucose, which will take, again, the same ATPs that you used, that you produced before. Now you're going to use those ATPs. Okay. This is called a futile cycle. Okay, because you are, instead of producing ATP, you just produce them and now you're using them again. So this is actually not yielding any energy at all. So your muscles did the work, but you know, you just used up the energy, and that's basically it. You're not getting any energy produced without any penalty. So what does that mean? You know, in a way, if you are trying to lose glucose or fat or calories, this is a good way to do that, because when you make your muscles work anaerobically, you use up the ATPs to move those muscles, and then the next day you're going to use more ATPs to turn the lactic acid back into glucose so that you can use it again. So you're kind of using up energy twice. You use up the ATPs to move, and then you use ATPs for the chemical reaction to convert lactic acid back into glucose. Okay, so the conversion of glucose into pyruvate into lactic acid, once again, is an anaerobic metabolism. It's an anaerobic reaction, and we call it lactic acid fermentation. So this is fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so that's it for glucose metabolism. Now let's take a look at how other molecules get used for energy. So we're talking about fat and protein. Take a look. Let's talk about how fat gets used for energy. So fat, if you guys remember, fat is mostly triglycerides. And triglycerides are the chains of fatty acids that are attached to a glycerol backbone. So here's the glycerol backbone, and then there's going to be chains of fatty acids like that attached to that glycerol backbone, like that. So these are the chains of fatty acids. All right, and that's what triglycerides look like. We're going to call this a triglyceride. Triglyceride, TG for short. Okay, so if you're going to use fat for energy, to make ATPs, that is, first you need to break it up. So you need to break up the glycerol and the fatty acids. You need to detach them from each other. And that is done by the process of hydrolysis. So hydrolysis, hydro means water, lysis means break. So what you're going to do is you're going to break up with using water 3 times. You're going to break up this molecule into glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Okay. Now, fatty acids can be short or can be long. Some are shorter, some are longer. You might remember that from the lecture on fats. But from here, your glycerol backbone and your 3 fatty acids are now separated. So these are fatty acids. Now, glycerol can be easily turned into pyruvate, and then you can do whatever you want from the pyruvate. You can take the pyruvate and turn it into acetyl groups, run the Krebs cycles, electron transport chain, or you can turn the pyruvate, turn to lactic acid, or you can turn the pyruvate back into glucose if necessary. Now, the glycerol is a pretty small part of triglycerides. So it's a pretty small, tiny part of it if you look at the mass of a fat cell, of a triglyceride. Most of the triglyceride is actually fatty acids like that. So the fatty acids make up the bulk of the fat. So the most important part when we talk about how we use fat for energy would be talking about how do we use fatty acids for energy. And the way we use them for energy is we actually take the fatty acids and break them up into 2 carbon units like that. So we break them up into 2 carbon units, which are called, the process of breaking it up is called beta oxidation. Beta oxidation. Beta oxidation is actually also reversible. So you can take these fatty acids and break them into these little 2 carbon units like that. And these 2 carbon units are basically the same as the acetyl groups. These acetyl groups right here, we join the main pathway at the acetyl group. So when fatty acids get broken down by beta oxidation, they turn into a whole bunch of acetyl groups. And these acetyl groups simply go on to the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to get you lots and lots of ATPs. Once again, very important part to remember, that when you're using those fatty acids for energy and you turn fatty acid into acetyl groups, the only thing you can do with these acetyl groups is burn them with oxygen, Very, very important. This means that you cannot use fats without oxygen. The only way you can burn the fat is with oxygen. So if you want to burn the fat on your body, you need aerobic metabolism, aerobic exercise to burn the fat. If you want to build the muscle, you want to push your muscles into anaerobic mode. If you want to burn the fat, you need aerobic exercise. So that means you need both aerobic and anaerobic exercise. Okay. One important, also important thing to remember about fats and using fats and using glucose. See, this is where the 2 pathways are connected, right at the point of fatty acids turning into acetyl groups. But also remember that acetyl groups can be turned back into fatty acids. You can take a whole bunch of acetyl groups and turn them back into fatty acids. Those fatty acids can be put together into triglycerides. What does that mean? Okay, if you look at this diagram, at this metabolic map very carefully, you can see what things can be reversed and what things cannot be reversed, what processes are reversible, which processes are not reversible. The only irreversible process is right here, between the pyruvate and the acetyl group. What does that mean? That means that when you take glucose and turn it into pyruvate, and then take the pyruvate and turn it into acyl groups, you cannot turn the acyl groups back into pyruvate, back into glucose. So what does that mean? It means that you can take the glucose, turn it into acyl groups, and then either burn it for energy or turn that into fat. So all the excess glucose can actually be turned into fat. That's how sometimes too much sugar can turn into fat and make you fat, okay? But if you try to go in reverse, you can't, because triglycerides can be turned into acyl groups, and the only thing you can do with these acyl groups is use it for energy with oxygen. You cannot turn acyl groups back into glucose because, again, this step is irreversible, and that means that you cannot take the fat and turn it into glucose. You can turn glucose into fat, but you cannot turn fat into the glucose. Okay, that's a very, very important part to remember. Once again, you can turn glucose into fat. So when you have too much glucose, you can turn it into pyruvates, pyruvate into acyl groups into fatty acids into triglycerides. But you cannot take the triglycerides, break it up, put the fatty acids through the beta oxidation, turn that into acyl groups, and turn acyl groups back into glucose because of this irreversible step. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, the last bit is to go over the other side of the metabolic map, and that is the side of the our proteins. Okay, so if you guys remember, proteins sometimes proteins are used for energy. That's not their primary function. Proteins' function is to serve as proteins. Remember, proteins are like little machines in your body. Each protein has a very important function. So when you eat protein from, I don't know, an egg or cheese or meat, whenever you eat protein from any of those dietary sources, those proteins get turned into amino acids. Okay, and you normally take the amino acids that came from your food, and you use these amino acids to make proteins of your own. Make your own hemoglobin, make your albumin, make muscle protein, make enzymes, make hormone receptors and things like that. You normally are supposed to take amino acids that came from food and turn them into your own proteins. But sometimes when you have excess amino acids or you are low on fuel like fat and glucose, you will start using amino acids for fuel. Okay? So amino acids can be used for fuel, but the problem with amino acids is the amino group. So if you want to use amino acids for fuel, you need to deaminate them first. Deaminate. Okay, and when you deaminate amino acids, that yields a waste molecule, which is ammonia. Okay, that's ammonia. Okay, the ammonia is basically poisonous for you if you keep it in the body. So you need to get rid of it. You need to excrete it. But ammonia cannot be excreted as is because it's not excretable by kidneys. So to make it excretable by kidneys, ammonia gets sent to the liver, and the liver turns ammonia into urea. And then urea gets taken out through kidneys. And then you pee it out. Okay? So urea is an important step. Making urea is an important step in the excretion of metabolic waste products of proteins and amino acids. But let's go back to this deamination. So when we deaminate amino acids, what's left of it becomes keto acids. And the keto acids can be turned into pyruvate. Okay, so keto acids can become pyruvate. And because they can become pyruvate, remember, pyruvate can be turned back into glucose by reverse glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis is perfectly reversible. So that means that what can you do with amino acids if you're not using them for making new proteins? Well, one thing is turn them into keto acids and turn keto acids into pyruvate. And then from pyruvate, you can do pretty much anything with that. You can take pyruvate and turn it back into glucose and use glucose or provide glucose for organs like brain and red blood cells for energy. Or you can take the pyruvate and turn it into the acetyl groups and run them through Krebs cycles and electron transport chains, get energy. Or you can take the pyruvate, turn it into the acetyl groups, and take the acetyl groups and turn that into fats and store that as fat. What does that mean? That means that besides making proteins, amino acids are extremely versatile for pretty much anything in your body. The only problem is that it's a dirty fuel. It produces a lot of the metabolic waste that needs to be excreted, so it might dehydrate you. But overall, amino acids can be used for anything. You can turn amino acids into glucose, which you cannot do with fat. You can turn amino acids into energy, so make ATPs. Or you can take amino acids and turn them into fat. So in the end, too much amino acids can also make you fat. All right. So glucose can be turned into fat. Amino acids can be turned into fat. Fat can only be used for energy. That's the only thing you can do with fat. Okay. I hope that this was helpful, and this will help you remember the metabolic map and understand the metabolic map. I strongly recommend that you draw this metabolic map multiple times. I would say 5 times at least. Label everything. Make sure that you are pointing all the arrows properly, and make sure that the arrows that are reversible are made reversible, and arrows that are one way are one way only. And I hope that this will help you understand this map better. All right, thank you very much, and have fun.